Hello. My name is Vincent David. I'm the editor of Spartacist, and this is part two of our two-part series on China, based on the article of the latest issue, Not Imperialist, Not Capitalist, the Class Nature of China. And in this video, we'll look at the functioning of the economy, of the Chinese economy, and basically demonstrate why China is not capitalist and why it remains what we called a deformed worker state, similarly to what Trotsky called the Soviet Union, a degenerated worker state. And we'll address some of the main argument used in the left or in the socialist movement internationally to prove that China is capitalist. Now, in discussing whether the Chinese state is capitalist or remains a worker state, it's important to establish some methodology because, similar to the question of imperialism, the left usually ends the argument where it begins. Among liberal commentators or in the left in general, that China is capitalist is not subject to much debate, actually. They look at the number of multinational corporations, the number of billionaires in China, and that usually solves the question. And there's not so much discussion about that. It's taken for granted, usually. And now, in the camp of those who support the Chinese Communist Party, in order to prove that China is socialist, they look at the number of state-owned enterprise, the number of the level of state control of the economy, and that solved the question for them. Now, both point of view are wrong. And once again, the question cannot be resolved by only looking at historical or a sort of individual snapshot, I should say, of the Chinese economy, but we must look at its concrete historical development. The proliferation of capitalists in China or the high level of nationalized industries are both key to understand China. However, they do not prove anything on their own. Trotsky argued in his famous text, The Class Nature of the Soviet State. He explained how the Bolsheviks, who seized power in Russia in October 1917, did not nationalize industry in the first year of the Russian Revolution. It remained private, but under workers' control. And in 1921, the Bolsheviks reintroduced market relations in the agriculture with the new economic policy. Yet, this did not mark a return to capitalism. Furthermore, it's been seen often in history how the capitalist class can itself nationalize large sectors of its economy in response to certain crises. So these various elements, all of this goes to show that the property forms taken as an isolated factor are not sufficient to determine the class nature of a country. So for Marxists, the crux of the question is the state itself. That is the armed forces and the bureaucracy. Which class do they defend? And there are great possible variations in the political forms that the state can take, whether it is a republic, a constitutional monarchy, or a Bonapartist or fascist dictatorship. In the end, these are only various political forms of the rule of a state, which defends the rule of one class. Summarizing Engels, Lenin explained, and I quote, "The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonism. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable." End quote. That's from The State and Revolution. And Lenin insisted in this book that a petty bourgeois democrat will never understand that the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, the class opposite to it. And so that's very important. Keep this in mind because we'll come back to it. And because every mistake regarding the class nature of China or its future prospects always flows from a revision of these basic concepts of the Marxist theory of the state as outlined by Lenin. And revisionism on this question starts with the Chinese Communist Party. If you take Mao's conception outlined on New Democracy, Mao projected a joint dictatorship of all revolutionary classes of China, which also included the nationalist bourgeoisie. And this proved to be a total illusion because Mao's peasant army ended up defeating the nationalist forces of the Kuomintang, and the entire bourgeoisie in China fled to Taiwan or was expropriated. And these revisions of Lenin's basic theory continue today. So Deng Xiaoping, for example, or Xi Jinping, the theory of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is the state ideology of the People's Republic of China, is based on the myth that there is no fundamental conflict between the bourgeoisie and socialism. And such illusions, whether it is from Mao's time all the way to Xi Jinping today, are a mortal threat to the People's Republic of China. And in a different way, the very socialist groups who claim that China is capitalist today make a similar mistake, albeit from a different standpoint. So those groups who say that China is capitalist usually do not argue that there's no conflict between capitalism and socialism, as the Chinese Communist Party does, but they argue that a gradual and seamless transition from China being a worker state after 1949 to being a capitalist state in the 1990s happened. According to them, there was a sort of gradual transition, which sometimes took years, sometimes decades, in which the Chinese state went through a fundamental transformation without acute crisis, without a fundamental break, without the state apparatus having been broken up, and got just sort of replaced organically by a new one. In other words, they think that the same state apparatus, the same bureaucracy, the same regime that was established in 1949 can sort of switch and defend the dictatorship of another class. And that the state, therefore, can sort of be the dictatorship of two antagonistic classes. And so this is just another way to erase the irreconcilable class interests that the very existence of the state embodies. Remember Lenin that we just talked about. Trotsky had already answered some of these arguments back in the 1930s in the text I just quoted you, in which he explained, and I quote, "The Marxist thesis relating to the catastrophic character of the transfer of power from the hands of one class into the hands of another applies not only to revolutionary period, when history sweeps madly ahead, but also to the periods of counter-revolution when society rolls backward. He who asserts that the Soviet government has been gradually changed from proletarian to bourgeois is only, so to speak, running backwards, the film of Reformism." And so running backward the film of Reformism is usually the basis upon which socialist group claim that China has been progressively reformed from a worker state into a capitalist one. So to establish the class character of China, the key criterion is not the degree to which market relations or the planned economy prevail, although these are important factors, don't get me wrong. But it is whether there's been a qualitative change in the nature and function of the state apparatus. Has the state been broken up and replaced by a new one? That's the basic theory outlined in Lenin's State and Revolution and in Engels before him. Those who believe that China is capitalist must either argue that Trotsky was wrong in the quote I just told you, the film of reformism running backwards. So they must either argue that Trotsky was wrong in that it is possible for a state to gradually change its character, or they must explain when and how the counter-revolution in China took place. And so a key difference between Trotsky in the 1930s and us today is that we have actually seen a series of clear historical examples of counter-revolutions. Basically, everyone on the left agrees that the former worker states of East Europe and the Soviet Union were destroyed and capitalism was restored there from between 1989 and 1991-92. So this process was different in the various countries, whether it is Poland, East Germany, Yugoslavia, or the Soviet Union itself. But every single one of these examples thoroughly confirms the catastrophic character of the transfer of power from the hands of one class into the hands of another, which I just spoke earlier. I'm not going to go through a detailed history of counter-revolution in every single one of these countries. And, there were particular national processes. But it is possible to distinguish several essential features common to all of these examples. In each case, an acute political crisis led to the collapse of the Stalinist regimes. In certain countries, former Stalinists were able to maintain prominent or even leading position under capitalism, but in no cases did the former Communist Party remain in power. In all cases, the state structure was thoroughly reorganized. In Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and the Soviet Union, the state broke up and liquidated. And even when the state didn't broke up as such, it went through a fundamental reorganization in its army, in its constitution, in its legal system, in basically every one of its key institutions. And so the consequence is pretty obvious to everyone. There is no more people's republics in Europe. There are no more red armies or people's armies. There's no more hammer and sickles on national flags, except for Transnistria, but that's probably the exception that proves the rule. And all these symbols have disappeared. And some might argue that these symbols are sort of meaningless, particularly when they defend that China is capitalist, but this is wrong. Because as a conquering army, capitalism brought also its symbol, its values, its legal system, its language, etc. Because in these changes represented a decisive rupture in state power. They represented capitalism's victory over Stalinism. If we look at the economic side of the question of the counter-revolutions in East Europe and Russia, so leading up to counter-revolution in the late 80s, many countries of the Eastern Bloc had started to introduce measures of liberalization of their economies. However, the return to capitalism there was not a gradual process. It was everywhere a brutal shock. Now it's known often as the shock therapy. So the old economic models abruptly collapsed and a new model was introduced, generally under the dictates of the IMF. And the immediate consequences were deindustrialization, mass unemployment, inflation, and recession. And in multiple places, the shock was absolutely catastrophic. Just go look at the life expectancy of Russia and its evolution. And you'll see that in the 80s, it gradually, progressively goes up. And when the turn of the 90s arrive and capitalism is reestablished, it comes as a tremendous shock and life expectancy completely falls sharply. So everywhere in East Europe and Russia, counter-revolutions were a brutal process, whether on the political, economic, or social level. The transition from a worker state to a capitalist state was abrupt and was made in the manner of a clear rupture with the past. Now, how does these historical experiences of counter-revolution compare with reform and opening up in China? If you take isolated factors, you could draw parallels, but it's obvious that if you take a step back, the process that happened in China in the 90s versus what happened in East Europe and Russia in the 90s are completely different and have nothing in common at all. And on the political level, it's the most obvious. So China was not spared of the turmoil of the late 1980s, centrally with the Tiananmen uprising, which there was a massive student and workers uprising demanding more freedoms, but also better conditions. And the result of this, however, is that contrary to the various Stalinist bureaucracies in East Europe and Russia, the Chinese Stalinists did not let go of power and were able to crush the movement in a bloody wave of repression. And as a result, the Chinese Communist Party strengthened its hold on political power. So the result of Tiananmen was political continuity, not rupture. And so therefore, today on the political level, the key institutions of the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949, still remain to this day. China is still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. The armed forces remain the People's Liberation Army, which traces its origins back to Mao. The People's Republic still stands, obviously. The highest state organ is still, formally at least, the National People's Congress, and the most prestigious post is still General Secretary of the Communist Party. No one disputes these facts. They're just considered irrelevant by everyone who says that China is capitalist. And if we look at the economic sphere, so I already mentioned how counter-revolution in the Eastern Bloc was done through a profound and catastrophic shock for the economies of Eastern Europe and Russia. Now, how does that compare with China? The 1990s in China saw not social and economic disintegration, but the most astounding development of productive forces in history, an unrivaled reduction in poverty, and a general improvement of pretty much every socio-economic indicators. So I'm not arguing that market liberalization in China were good for the working class or done according to their interests. It came with privatization, with unemployment, huge layers of the working class suffering in terrible condition and used as cheap labor for foreign companies. But taken as a whole, the Chinese economy simply did not go through the same catastrophic process that happened in East Europe and Russia. So the process of reform and opening up had dramatic consequences in China, but it was done incrementally in a way that maintained the overall structure of society. And in fact, that was the entire point of reform and opening up. So many people say that Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up was how capitalism was reintroduced in China. But actually, when you look a little bit at how this policy was crafted and how it was implemented, it was done not to restore capitalism, but to create the economic conditions for the Chinese Communist Party to avoid the fate of the other Stalinist regimes. Just look at what Deng Xiaoping said during his 1992 Southern tour, which usually is considered as the turning point for the restoration of capitalism by many on the left. And you can see how he presented the problem himself. In our article, we have a long quote. I'm not going to read it all, but basically what he explained is that he basically takes up that the building of the special economic zones, some people disagreed with the idea right from the start, wondering whether it would not mean introducing capitalism. And he goes on about the Shenzhen area and how it gives people and basically his answer is that special economic zones are socialist, not capitalist. In the case of Shenzhen, the publicly owned sector is the mainstay of the economy, with the foreign invested sector accounts for only a quarter. There is no reason to be afraid of them. So long as we keep level-headed, there is no cause for alarm. We have our advantages. We have the large and medium-sized state-owned enterprises and the rural enterprise. Most important, political power is in our hands. So that's Deng Xiaoping. And I'm reading that not to assess whether Deng was truthful or not about his commitment to socialism. That's irrelevant. Rather, the point is that Deng justified this policy not by motivating a rupture with the old model, but actually continuity. As he insists himself, most important, political power is in our hands. And that was always the cornerstone of reform and opening up. These are not the word of a Boris Yeltsin, which is hell-bent on reestablishing capitalism. No, they are the one of more of a right-wing Stalinist reformer who is seeking to maintain the regime. And so it's really important to understand this process, as I outlined earlier with the question of method and with the historical examples of counter-revolution. What makes a revolution and what makes a counter-revolution is related to the state. Has the state been broken up and replaced by a new one or not? And so the state and their forms and the structure of the economies can go through multiple changes. But at the end of the day, the class nature of a state requires a fundamental break, a fundamental period where it is broken up and replaced by a new one. And we see how in China, this process that took place in Eastern Europe simply didn't happen, and that the same state structure is still, that's still what the People's Republic of China is since 1949. So confronted with the obvious fact that the Chinese regime and the state have remained essentially intact, the various proponents of the view that China is capitalist must either ignore this or explain it away theoretically. And I'll just look at two examples here. The first is the militant tradition. So the militant tendency is the sort of tradition in which three of the main big Trotskyist organization worldwide originate from. The Revolutionary Communist International, the Committee for Workers International, and the International Socialist Alternative are three big organizations which all trace their origins in the militant tendency. And in the 70s and 80s, the militant tendency, which was centrally based in Britain, was known for its theory of parliamentary socialism, of the concept of promoting the conception that you could peacefully seize control of the capitalist state and introduce socialism through an enabling act in parliament. That was always the signature of militant tendency, which was a tendency inside the Labour Party. And so it's not a coincidence that its various descendants are among the most vocal proponents of the view that China is capitalist. Because people in the militant tendency in the late 80s, when various worker states in Eastern Europe started to liberalize their economies, they had introduced this new conception that actually these states had become hybrid states, that you couldn't say that they were capitalist or worker states. It was sort of hybrid in transformation. So gone is Lenin's irreconcilability of class antagonism, and in comes the porous hybrid states, which sort of defend different classes, whatever the day it is. And the concrete result of this revisionist theory was that all the militant tendency, none of them opposed counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, and the Committee for Workers International took an active part on the barricades erected by Yeltsin to bring down the USSR. Because in denying that a counter-revolution was necessary, you had this hybrid state, there was no counter-revolution, was not really on the cards, they ended up participating in a counter-revolution. Because after all, if there was nothing to defend in Russia in 1991, then, there's nothing to defend. So, because it's not a worker state. So the catastrophic consequence of this totally revisionist conception was shown, obviously, with the counter-revolution, which, had a absolutely catastrophic impact on all the left, on all the workers' movement internationally, led to the destruction of the Soviet Union. And instead of learning from this absolute mistake, they've basically extended that theory to China today. So the CWI still depends what you read usually, but still defends that China is some sort of hybrid state. As for the International Socialist Alternative, which is a split from the CWI, they argue that China was a hybrid state, but basically solved its hybrid character and became a full-on capitalist state sometimes in the 90s, usually with Tiananmen. But as we've seen, the result of Tiananmen was not capitalist restoration. It was the consolidation of the regime. And what's behind this entire theory, you see, I introduced Militant by saying they were for peacefully taking over the capitalist state through an act in parliament. That was their signature in Britain. If you have this conception, then, well, yes, it is possible to think that a worker state like China could, gradually or peacefully transform itself into a capitalist state. Remember Trotsky running backward the film of Reformism. That's exactly what's at the heart of all those groups who are from the militant tradition. That's exactly what's at the heart of their conception of China as a capitalist state, a sort of gradual transformation, not the result of a shock, of a counter-revolution. The other tendency I'll just briefly touch on is the Revolutionary Communist Internationalist tendency. They come from a very different political tradition, and at least they do give some consideration to the question of political power. According to them, a capitalist counter-revolution takes place when a Stalinist bureaucratic workers' government is replaced or transformed itself into a bourgeois restorationist government that is firmly resolved, both in words and deeds, to reestablish a capitalist mode of production. Now, we've seen already that actually the top of the Chinese Communist Party are not at all resolved to reestablish capitalism. For them, it is socialism with Chinese characteristics. However, the question is, how can a Stalinist bureaucratic workers' government transform itself into a bourgeois restorist government? How is this possible? as we said, the state being broken up. For them, like, the actual apparatus, the actual Stalinist bureaucracy sort of mutated themselves into a capitalist class. Well, this is possible for them because they argue that the reason is that the bourgeois bureaucratic state machine, that is the police, the standing army, the bureaucracy, is not a proletarian instrument, but one of the petty bourgeois Stalinist bureaucracy, which is much closer to the bourgeoisie than the working class. So it's correct to say that the Stalinist bureaucracy is petty bourgeois in character, but it's absolutely wrong to say that the state machine that the bureaucracy commands is not proletarian. It's actually revisionist, because if that's your conception, then it negates the entire point of a worker state, even the deformed one. Like, in The State and Revolution, Lenin explained, like all great revolutionary thinker, Engels tried to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to what prevailing Philistinisms regards at least worthy of attention as the most habitual thing, hollowed by prejudices that are not only deep-rooted, but one might say petrified. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. The chief instrument of state power, of the dictatorship of the proletariat in China, are a standing army and police, just as for every other class dictatorship, slavocracy, feudal, capitalist. And in a worker state that is bureaucratically deformed by a Stalinist bureaucracy, these bodies of armed men are wielded against the political interests of the working class by a bureaucracy, but they remain organs of a worker state. In China, the People's Liberation Army has been used to suppress the left-wing discontent of the working class, as seen in Tiananmen, but the PLA has destroyed the Chinese capitalist class and established the dictatorship of the proletariat with the flood of the bourgeoisie in Taiwan. So does the PLA is a petty bourgeois organ, or is the People's Republic of China a petty bourgeois state before the 90s? No. Since 1949, the PLA has been the key organ of proletarian power against the internal and external threat of counter-revolution. And it's because of the PLA that the Chinese bourgeoisie in Taiwan hasn't been able to come back. And so what the theory of the RCIT erases is precisely this class character of the state, the irreconcilability of class interest. And following this logic, the RCIT not only declares that China is capitalist, but they've now discovered capitalism everywhere. For them, North Korea is capitalist, Cuba is capitalist, Vietnam is capitalist, because by erasing the need for a counter-revolution, a fundamental qualitative change in the state apparatus, they discover capitalism everywhere. Even in those countries where they have economies and regimes obviously or based on a typical Stalinist model. Okay, so far, our argument have been quite theoretical, and there's no doubt that reaffirming basic Marxist principles on the state will not convince our critics. They will answer that, look, these are theoretical points. The fact is there's 815 billionaires in China. Some of the biggest capitalist corporations are Chinese. There's tremendous capitalist penetration in China. And even state-owned enterprise in China function according to market principles. So these are certainly important facts, but to properly understand them and interpret them, they must be placed in a correct understanding of the historical laws guiding China's development. So China is a deformed worker state that has capitalists. That is a highly contradictory and unusual development. But it does not invalidate the Marxist theory of the state. Rather, it's only with Marxist theory that you can properly make sense of all the empirical evidence and statistical data and answer the question of who really rules China. That's the question we need to answer. Who calls the shot in China? So we have already seen the value of theories positing the gradual change of China's class character. But most who think that China is capitalist focused less on theoretical problem and more on impressionistic interpretation of empirical facts. Like I said, quoting a bunch of statistic about how many capitalists they are, how many capitalist companies operate in China. A good example of this is the recent polemic written by the Revolutionary Communist International, titled "Is the East Still Red? Answering Those That Deny China is Capitalist." And in this, the RCI tries to demonstrate how it is clear that the state in China does not dominate the economy. The point is that the banks are primarily accountable to the government. They dispute the claim that banks are primarily accountable to the state rather than shareholder, and that in fact the whole economy is organized around the market, and that the Chinese Communist Party is more or less is powerless in front of these forces and is increasingly losing control. And to support this position, the RCI points to the fact that the economic measures taken by the Chinese Communist Party following the 2008 financial crisis fostered, deep problems and imbalances in the economy. This is true. However, it proves that the Chinese Communist Party's policies are wrong, but it doesn't prove that the Chinese Communist Party is ruled by the market or has lost control on the economy. In fact, actually, many scholars point to the opposite. There's an excellent book which I recommend, which is titled "The Party" by Richard McGregor, and it's a pretty good book because he explains how the Chinese Communist Party reacted to the 2008 crisis in a manner which is fundamentally different from all capitalist economies, essentially. He explains, for example, how the Politburo forced the banks in China to lend money, something that couldn't be done in the West. And he explains, and he sort of laid this excellent picture, how China behaved in a completely different manner than in the West. So in the West, despite the governments basically controlling banks in that period, they had no real means to force them to lend money. Meanwhile, in China, that's exactly what they did. And fundamentally, what the financial crisis show is that since China and the US are two completely different social regimes, they responded completely differently. In the West, where the market dominates, the state stepped in to save the financial system from ruin and ensure profitability and stability. In China, where the CPC controls the economy, the state intervened to ensure the stability of the regime. And in this process, it acted contrary to the principles of profitability that banks had spent like decades to establish. So the RCI does not address this. They observe the existence of a speculative bubble after 2008 and conclude that, China is capitalist and the Chinese Communist Party has lost control. But then again, you have to look a little more than just superficially. How has the Chinese Communists reacted to this speculative bubble? In 2020, the CPC introduced the 3 red lines regulation, which was specifically aimed at bursting the housing bubble. This led to the real estate giant Evergrande going bankrupt and the entire sector entering a depression. So this policy was devastating. I'm not defending any of it. Millions of people who paid for apartment will just not get it, But this example is useful because it shows how the CPC is zigzagging from one extreme to another in the typical Stalinist manner, and prove that it shows that the CPC actually is not powerless before the market. And once more, it shows the difference between how the CPC operates and how the US government operates. So in China, the Chinese Communist Party burst the speculative bubble to avoid a sharp crisis that could lead to political instability. In the US case, the government did everything it could to keep the housing bubble going for as long as possible, and now today is doing the same thing with the entire stock market. These are all facts, but without a correct understanding of the laws guiding the actions of either the Chinese bureaucracy or the US imperialist class, you can't really make sense of them. And part of the difficulty to understand China is because the Chinese Communist Party has worked for decades to give the People's Republic of China the appearance of a market economy in order to attract foreign investment and discipline its own workforce. And so it, privatized state-owned enterprise. It gave them like some, independent boards of directors, let private capitalists grow multi-billion-dollar corporations, etc. But it's necessary to look a bit behind this sort of appearance of liberalization to see that the CPC keeps an iron grip on both public and private companies. So it's misleading to only look in China to look at private or public companies, because whether it is formally public or private, sometimes it switches to, the party grip, the Chinese Communist Party maintains firm control on this. And again, this book that I mentioned earlier, The Party by McGregor, I think gives a pretty good picture of how the economy is organized in China. You have multiple institutions, such as the Central Organization Department, who basically appoint and direct every key sector of the political, economic, and social life in China. And so these institutions are there to maintain the Chinese Communist Party control over, all aspect of life, basically. So McGregor makes a comparison between, imagine, let's say the Central Organization Department existed in the U.S., and he explains, I think it's worth quoting a bit. He explained that a similar department in the U.S. would oversee the appointment of the entire U.S. cabinet, state governors and their deputies, the mayors of major cities, the head of all federal regulatory agencies, the chief executive of GE, ExxonMobil, Walmart, and about 50 of the remaining largest U.S. companies, the justices of the Supreme Court, the editor of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the bosses of TV networks, president of Yale and Harvard and other big universities, and the head of think tanks, etc., etc. So he basically dictates, he basically lays a picture of the role of the party in the entire economy. And control by the Chinese Communist Party is not dictated by profit motive. Actually, as this sort of example lays out, it directly clashes with the most basic rules. Now, another example would be a famous case in 2004 when the Central Organization Department decided to rotate the head of the three largest telecom companies, which were in competition with each other. Now think of it like a government agencies rotated the head of the main telecom companies between each other. This is like if the U.S. government would, rotate Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and make one of them in charge of Tesla and the other in charge of Meta. Like, that doesn't happen in a normal capitalist country. And this is a clear proof that it is not the market dictating the terms to the state, but the opposite. So despite all the statistics that can be produced and evidence that can be shown over the prevalence of capitalist relations in China, the basic fact is that the capitalist class does not hold state power. It's the Chinese Communist Party that calls the shots, and its upper echelon. So yes, there are a lot of capitalists, and there's been a huge growth of capitalist relations in China, yes, but this is a result of the Chinese Communist Party having worked in alliance with capitalists over the past decades. This does not mean, however, that the Chinese Communist Party's interests are the same as those of the capitalist class's interests, or that its policies are guided strictly by the capitalist needs. Actually, quite the contrary. And what the Communist Party bureaucracy does is it continues to occupy an intermediary position between capital, both foreign and domestic, as well as the working class and its political and economic demand. And the Chinese Communist Party is this force caught between the middle, in which wields the state against both these forces to maintain its position, just like the Stalinist bureaucracy did in the Soviet Union. Often one argument we hear about China being capitalist is that, well, China is a Bonapartist capitalism. And you see this in other countries. That's why you cannot directly compare it to the US. And often it is compared to like Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran, which are capitalist countries where the main regime in place will use coercion and force against capitalists to make sure they respect the dictates of the regime. So if we look just at Saudi Arabia and Russia, like Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. And the most famous example is in 2007, where the crown prince of Saudi Arabia sequestrated hundreds of Saudi capitalists, mainly relatives, and extorted billions out of them. Or Putin, arranged in 2003 for his rival, Khodorkovsky, probably butchered his name right there. Anyway, he arranged for his rival, which was Russia's richest man, to be imprisoned in Siberia. So how does this... how do these cases are different from the CPC regularly, coercing capitalists as well? Well, we have to look at the social basis of these various regimes and its relation to the domestic capitalist class. So Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy since World War II and has depended on its military alliance with the US to maintain itself as sort of a bastion of reaction in the entire Middle East. And the royal family is basically the capitalist class there. So this famous incident in 2017, which was sort of looked like a feud or something translated into the modern world, is actually the norm for a capitalist country ruled by an absolute monarchy. In Russia, Putin rose to power in the context of sort of war between various oligarchs and violent feuds between them. And Putin rose really as the reason the Bonapartist character of his government is a result of the need for an arbiter among various oligarchs, which sometimes requires repressing an individual oligarchs who steps out of line. So in this context, that's how Putin asserted his authority, sort of the arbiter of oligarchs. So in both these cases, Bonapartist measures of repression served to uphold the stability of the capitalist regime. However, in China, the Bonapartist nature of the People's Republic is actually fundamentally different. So after 1949, the Chinese Communist Party's power was built on bureaucratic control over a worker state which had crushed the capitalist class. And this sort of party layers at the top, which took control of the economy, were opposed to a revolutionary internationalist program in a classic Stalinist manner, and they found themselves constantly squeezed between the backward character of the economy, the economic and political demands of workers, and the hostile pressure from world imperialism. And with Stalinism collapsing around the 1990s, the CPC simply opted to lean more forcefully towards the force that had the wind in their sail, the imperialists and the capitalists. So the global context changed, but not the regime itself. And the Bonapartist nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime is still fundamentally derived from the same class force. So unlike Saudi Arabia or Russia, the capitalist class in China is not the base of the regime, but actually a rival. That is true even though many capitalists are members of the Communist Party or married to Communist Party tops. Class antagonism cannot be overcome through marriage and titles. If you think of the French aristocracy, they learned that lesson in the hard way. And so, although the regime in China and Russia or Saudi Arabia are all Bonapartists, they cannot transcend like fundamentally different social interests and bases. And they act according to these. So dynastic for the Saudi monarchy, oligarchic for Putin in Russia, and Stalinist bureaucratic in the case of Xi. And in the case of the first two, so Saudi Arabia or Russia, the power of the ruling strata rests on the capitalist class. And they can attack individual capitalists, but to attack the capitalist fundamental interests would be contrary to the very nature of these regimes. But that's not the case in China or with the Chinese Communist Party. Because, well, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party has expropriated the bourgeoisie once in 1949. And under extreme pressure, external or internal, it could do so again. Let's not forget that Mao, who did expropriate the capitalist class, also did not want it at first to expropriate the national bourgeoisie, but was forced to do so in the context of civil war. The different class basis of these three regimes can further be seen if you look at how do billionaires and capitalists view them. So Saudi Arabia, despite its despotic nature, billionaires and millionaires flock to Saudi Arabia. In Russia, although the outbreak of the war in Ukraine and Western sanction has led to the departure of a number of wealthy individuals, since then the oligarchs have more or less rallied to the regimes, and actually a lot of wealth has been repatriated to Russia in terms of assets and dollars. This is because the regime is deemed by these oligarchs an indispensable pillar of support to their wealth in the face of Western hostility. In China, we see the exact opposite. Capitalists fear the regime more than the West, where they actually leave and emigrate in drove as soon as they get the chances. It's very hard to get a capitalist, get money out of China. There's tremendous restrictions. But nevertheless, since the pandemic, China tops the lists of the country where capitalists and very rich people leave. And as you can see, as a result, over the last few years, part of the stagnation of the Chinese economy, the number of venture capitalists and investments in highly profitable, sort of enterprise and ventures has completely plummeted. And so if China is a capitalist country, how come capitalists, and I'm talking about domestic capitalists too, in China, how come are they so scared of that regime? Why do capitalists in other dictatorships not fear their government in such way? Property rights. The other argument used by many Trotskyists is to say that, those who say that the Chinese Stalinist bureaucracy transformed itself into a ruling class is by looking at property right, i.e. the fact that Communist Party officials and their relatives own stocks or can even pass them to their children. And that for them is the argument that it's a capitalist class. On a superficial level, it might appear true, but the actual significance of these property right is not that straightforward. And that's an interesting bit. If we look at the legal right quickly, the People's Republic of China's constitution states that, quote, citizens' lawful private property is inviolable and that the state shall protect the right of citizens to own and inherit private property in accordance with the provisions of law. Okay, any capitalist country has similar provisions in their constitutions, right? However, this does not close the matter, because that same constitution also states that the state shall safeguard the unity and sanctity of the socialist legal system, and that socialist public property is sacred and inviolable. And then Article 1 of the Constitution, number 1, states, the People's Republic of China is a socialist state governed by a people's democratic dictatorship that is led by the working class and based on an alliance of workers and peasants. The socialist system is the fundamental system of the People's Republic of China. Leadership by the Chinese Communist Party of China is the defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is prohibited for any organization or individual to damage the socialist system. That is Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, how can such articles cohabit with the state duty to defend private property as inviolable? I will leave to the scholars of the Chinese Communist Party to explain how exactly does this work. And second, for those who say China is capitalist, don't you think that if there had been the reestablishment of capitalism in China, getting rid of Article 1 of the Constitution, which says that China is a socialist state, and that it is prohibited to hurt socialism would have been maybe the first thing you sort of get rid of. Food for thought. But let's go beyond just the legal system, what's written on paper, and let's look at really how it takes place. Private property in China. A basic criterion for private property is the ability to dispose freely of the property one possesses. That's the whole point of property being private, right? You do whatever you want with it. Now, the question is, do capitalists in China control their assets? And the response is yes, but only if they use them in a way that corresponds to the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party. So individual capitalists own shares of companies, including state-owned companies, but they do not have ultimate control over their business. I've already explained how the Communist Party appoints all the major CEOs of the main companies, but the party control goes further. There's countless examples of the Communist Party stepping in, either directly or indirectly, to make clear that property might be private on paper, but really is not that private, actually. So the clearest example are China started to copy the West by rewarding top CEOs with stock options in SOEs, in state-owned enterprise. But when these CEOs with these stock options decided they wanted to sell these shares, they were made to understand that actually you can't do this. And so stock options of state-owned enterprise in China is like a piece of the rainforest. You can hang it on your wall. It's there. You own it, but that's it. And then there's countless other examples where the Communist Party intervenes in ways that completely contradict basic functioning of profitability and private property. So the most famous example is obviously the Ant Group and Jack Ma. So the Ant Group, this huge company, huge Chinese capitalist company, had the public offering of the Ant Group after its owner Jack Ma criticized the party was halted by the Chinese Communist Party. And Ant's parent company lost billions, and Jack Ma disappeared from public view for years, actually. And following that scandal, the conglomerate went through a restructuring, and Ma's share of his own company went from 53% to just 6.2%. Just like that. Now, you don't see much capitalist countries where capitalists, after criticizing the party, disappear and reappear and then announce a restructuration where they lose basically all control over their own company. And there are countless other examples where a party control really over what a company does or doesn't do, constantly happens. And that's not without even speaking of the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has party committees in every company, has seats on the boards of companies, has trade unions also, which are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So the flexible nature of Chinese private property is seen most clearly in times of crisis. And during the COVID pandemic, and that was really obvious, the Chinese Communist Party was able to marshal tremendous resources way beyond that of any capitalist country. And so the pandemic hit everywhere, and everywhere government reacted in all sorts of ways. But in capitalist countries, no matter how harsh their measures were, they were always restricted by the private nature of property. They could pressure capitalist companies to do something, but they couldn't dictate anything. So they could only orient the production of goods and services in a limited way. Now, in contrast, in China, they could mobilize all of society to achieve the aims decided by the committee, by the head of the government, which is the Chinese Communist Party. This was possible not because China has an authoritarian government. That's usually the argument that's used. They're very authoritarian. Actually, if you think about it, in the pandemic, all governments became authoritarian. This was possible in China because they could disregard private capitalist interest and subordinate them to a plan decided by the Politburo. And so, without a doubt, the current situation in China is not like that of the Soviet Union. There's definitely a big capitalist class there. However, the reality is that private ownership there is contradictory. And that's because the capitalist as a class have yet to fully secure their claim. They do not have state power. They do not have full economic and political control because the armed forces of the country, of the state, are not loyal to them, but to the Chinese Communist Party bureaucracy. For the capitalist to establish its dictatorship in China, this reality must change, and that would mean they would need to break up the power of the Chinese Communist Party and break up the current state structure of the People's Republic. So what would a counter-revolution look like in China? The example of the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia give us a sense, like civil war would be a possibility. And overall, capitalists would have unbridled control over the economy. State enterprise would surely be privatized to a much higher level than they are now. The government will lose control of the banking sector, and capital flows would be liberalized, so making the Chinese market much more dependent on imperialist finance capital, which would certainly flood the country. And millions, no doubt, would lose their job in restructuring plans. And this time, all of this would not happen through a massive boost of the economy, but really through social and economic disintegration. We could see reunification as well of Taiwan and China, but on a reactionary basis, based on the reestablishment of capitalism and of the old Republic of China, which is the aim of the Kuomintang of Taiwan. And the international impact of a counter-revolution in China would also be disastrous. So just like the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the People's Republic of China would shore up the position of the United States and its allies, allowing them once more to basically do what they want to do, a new period of U.S. hegemony, just like during the 1990s. And, with the U.S. in decline today, one of their best shot at getting out of the dire position they are is if there was a counter-revolution in China. And furthermore, the demise of the PRC would provoke a massive destruction of productive forces that would occur in the context of restoration of capitalism, and which would depress living standards probably across the planet. So given all of this, if we come back to our left organization that say that China is capitalist, those who say that there is anything to defend in China today and call themselves Marxist and claim that China is capitalist are really actively working towards towards this catastrophic disaster. And in so doing, they really are preparing themselves to redo the same disaster that plagued the left in the 1980s and 90s. Because when the Soviet Union faced counter-revolution, most of left organization and socialist group, with ourselves being the exception, honestly, either supported counter-revolution or actively participated in it and cheered it. From Poland to East Germany to the Soviet Union, really they played a completely treacherous role. And rather than learning from this profound mistakes, which had catastrophic consequences, they are basically preparing the same mistake again over China. And rather than seeking to learn from it and say, oh, we should defend China against counter-revolution, while at the same time opposing the Stalinist regime, they often support explicitly pro-imperialist movements such as the Hong Kong democracy protest or the Sunflower movement in Taiwan. Instead of breaking these Chinese dissidents from liberal democratic illusions and training them to be communist revolutionaries, they end up reinforcing the counter-revolutionary currents in Chinese society. And so that is the concrete political implication of those left group who claim that China is capitalist or imperialist and that there's nothing to defend there. It is working towards a new counter-revolutionary wave, essentially. Luckily, the fate of the People's Republic of China is not yet sealed and will be decided by the action of the Chinese working class, the most powerful working class in the world. However, to defeat counter-revolution and to advance, it must be conscious of its political task. And this means understanding that the gains of the 1949 revolution can only be secured by the revolutionary overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party. This means a political revolution. That's what we mean by it. And unlike a revolution in a capitalist country, the reason why it's a political revolution is that the state apparatus does not need to be fully broken up, but rather just needs to be purged from top to bottom and brought under workers' control. Given the degree of degeneration of the People's Republic of China and the widespread influence of capitalism, a political revolution would obviously include radical and convulsive transformation. For example, expropriating sectors of capitalist industry. And the capitalists will no doubt resist, but they will be fundamentally hampered in that resistance for the simple reason that the state is not under their control. And as the events in Tiananmen have shown, under the impulse of the proletariat, in a deformed worker state, the state apparatus starts to fracture down the middle. And so in Tiananmen in 1989, whole battalions of the People's Liberation Army, including top military commanders, refused orders. And that's what happened to a Stalinist bureaucracy when it is faced with a tremendous crisis and working class action. It's sort of suspended in midair and it starts to disintegrate very rapidly. We've seen it in Hungary in 1956, in East Germany in 1989. And so with a working class uprising, there is a real possibility of bringing over to its side actually the bulk of the state apparatus. This is something that's impossible in a capitalist state, and a key, actually, distinguishing factor between a political and a social revolution. So just to conclude quickly, so we've shown how China is neither imperialist nor is it capitalist. That said, it's obvious that when one look at China, it's obvious that we're looking at a really unique phenomenon. The growth in China has been on unprecedented levels in human history, combining both state control and capitalism. And out of this, many bourgeois ideologues say that this shows the triumph and superiority of capitalism and free market. And supporters of the Chinese Communist Party, on the other hand, say no, this shows the triumph of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And as for the Marxists who say China is capitalist, well, they have to sort of deny or downplay the tremendous accomplishment of the People's Republic of China, but they cannot explain them. So, and to explain these, as I've tried to lay out in these two videos, it's necessary to start from the very unusual conditions following World War II, and then after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. It's not sufficient to just quote Lenin and Trotsky. We have to extend their theories and their analysis. And one of the main points is that neither Lenin nor Trotsky ever faced a situation in which the main imperialist powers were all united in one sort of cartel and facing the overwhelming domination of one power, the US. So at bottom, the originality of the post-Soviet period, this is what explains the China's development. China's development is not a result of the triumph of imperialism nor the triumph of Stalinism, but really is the result of these unusual circumstances that marked the world after World War II, but crucially after the Counterrevolution in the Soviet Union. The crushing of the Tiananmen uprising in 1989 closed the door to the restoration of capitalism, while also to a political revolution. And China emerged in the 1990s intact as a worker state and facing a relatively benign international context, with the US sort of quite happy actually to engage into reform and opening up. And so far, the Communist Party has seemed to have come on top with this deal with the devil, in a sense, with the United States. But high growth and coexistence with imperialism were possible only because the external pressures on the regimes were at an ebb. But as the international context is changing and as the United States is confronting China again, growth is stagnating. The economy is facing structural problems. The whole model, basically, of the growth of the last 30 years is unraveling, and which is leading to also increased internal tensions in the country. And despite the Communist Party's best effort to erase the class struggle, the struggle between workers and capitalists, between workers and the imperialists, between workers and the bureaucrats will again come at the forefront of the political scene. And this is where we will be able to see just how much Chinese Stalinism has hollowed out the worker state. So basically, the avenue that we're facing is whether or not the People's Republic of China can be saved from counter-revolution will be decided by the political leadership standing at the head of the working class. And if pro-capitalist, pro-democracy forces are allowed by the socialist movement to take the lead, the People's Republic of China is doomed. This is what happened in the Soviet Union in the 80s. It was pro-democracy movement that actually were the spearhead of the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. However, if Stalinism, whatever its form, is conciliated, covered for, and left in power, the People's Republic of China is also doomed. So the only road is that of the Fourth International, ruthlessly opposing imperialism, defending the social gains of the revolution, fighting for the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy, and forging really a working class international alliance for socialism. And so this is what we're fighting for. This is what we've tried to lay out in this video. So like and subscribe. Check out the links below. I'll post a few of our articles on the question, and follow for more.